Hello, Marek. Welcome to episode 2.
Thank you.
Marek is a good friend of mine, and I think he has some very nuanced and fun takes on many topics. But for now, I'm going to ask, um, what has the past half year been like for figuring out what you believe about spirituality and religion? And of course, that's a very, very broad answer, but let's take it wherever you want to go and talk about that.
Well, I'll briefly describe the history of my religious faith, or lack thereof.
Sure.
So, I'm from a fairly secular family, but with a Muslim background. From the time I was, well, for as long as I can as long ago as I can remember, I believed in God. I didn't have any particular reasons for or against, but believed intuitively, and I certainly didn't practice any religion, and I don't know if I believed in the god of any specific religion, but I guess I was a monotheist. And around the time that I was 7 or 8 years old, for some unspecified reason, which I still cannot remember to this day, I became a very staunch atheist, something close to a militant atheist, as Richard Dawkins might describe it.
And do you know anything like any cultural forces surrounding you that led you to that conclusion?
I really couldn't say. I think that my disbelief in God came as randomly and unexplainably as my previous belief in God. And so thereafter, I was a fairly anti-religious person, not just unreligious, but anti-religious, which is perhaps an important distinction. And then around the time that I was in grade 10, I started researching religion again. I don't remember what exactly spurred me to do this, but I started researching it maybe predominantly from the psychological point of view, so I was still very much a materialist, and I was more interested in how, I guess, how the Jungian interpretation of religion might see it as an outward manifestation of the subconscious or something like that.
So you're more interested in what brought people to these beliefs?
At least previously I was.
Sure,
yes.
yeah, at that point in time. And did you come to any conclusions about that, or was it just like dabbling because of interest, or did that affect you in any way?
Well, as far as conclusions go, I was still at that point certainly a very devoted atheist, I would say. I did not question my lack of faith. And what was the second part of that question?
So like what kind of conclusions did you come to?
I suppose the conclusion that I came to was that religion was not literally true, and I certainly strongly disbelieved in any kind of supernatural occurrences.
So it's just a more fleshed out understanding of what you already
yes,
had. Yeah,
but I came to respect religion as a highly practical set of fictional stories which would illuminate certain things about how one should live.
Sure, yeah, okay. Next, what happened?
Then, let's see, what happened next? Well, I guess from analyzing religion from more of a psychological viewpoint, how would I put it? My research about religion from the psychological standpoint typically involved how religion symbolically manifests psychological ideas. And so from there I found out about an Eastern Orthodox icon carver and cultural commentator named Jonathan Pageau, who's known for his highly symbolic interpretation of the biblical stories, I suppose. And from there, I found out about a school of philosophy called the perennialists, sometimes called the traditionalists. So Rene Guénon, Frithjof Schuon, Syed Hossein Nasr, and some others. And that might have been what caused me to realize that there is a genuine possibility that God exists, or it might have been something else. I don't know.
Okay, so that's a lot, and that kind of is. Would you say that's that the foundations of your, let's say, ideological disposition that you have come to now, or at least like something that it has grown out of? That this kind of understanding of like the symbolism, and then a sort of beginning of questioning of what actually is to be understood and known through faith.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that takes us about up to the past, well, up to the present, I guess. One thing that I should probably add is that my brother took a philosophy of religion class, and so from doing some readings in his textbook, I encountered some of the classical arguments for and against God, so teleological, cosmological, and ontological, I believe, although I couldn't necessarily describe in detail what each of them is, or the finer details, but that's perhaps an important happening of from 1 or 2 years ago that might have led me in the direction of considering religion not just from a psychological point of view, but also as something which may have some literal truth as well.
Okay. Very cool. So I think that gives us a lot to work with then, and I think that gives you a great foundation of similarity between my journey. But we're not going to focus on that. We're going to kind of focus on my conclusions, because I do think that there is some difference in the conclusions that we come to.
Mm-hmm.
The whole argument for the existence of God is kind of uninteresting to me personally, because at the end of the day, it is so abstract and unknown that, um, like at any understanding that we might have of any divinity is kind of almost veiled to us, and I think that's kind of the point of the divine. Um, so I think that anything that is reference of um, something that is divine is beyond perception, unable to be sensed unless by some force, some god figure wants to be revealed as to be sensed. And but of course I am very critical of that, because I don't think personally that's been anything in my life. And whenever I hear testimony of that, I'm very critical and skeptical about that experience. So I'm
About the idea that that personal religious experience could be useful.
let's not say religious experience, but like revelation, like revelatory experience,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's just not. I think it's selfish to assume that there's something beyond our perception that would appeal to any individual over the other. And so that's kind of one of my hookups with like organized religions, etc. But um, so when you come to like these formal arguments for God, let's say, is there any in particular that like has struck your interest and like has actually found like meaning? Because like me personally, I'm not ignoring like any of the developments in this field, but it's just personally not interesting to me. But I want to know how that is um, understood by you to find like that you've found significance in it. So
Mm-hmm.
go into that. Like, is there any one of those arguments in specific, or just in general, or
Well, in general, I think the importance of these arguments is that well, either God does exist or God doesn't exist.
mm-hmm.
And if God does exist, then I feel that I had better devote my life to worshiping him in whatever way he
Yeah.
sees fit. And if he doesn't exist, then no way I'm going to waste my life worshiping something that doesn't
Yeah,
exist,
I
right?
think there's a lot of
So,
sentiment surrounding that, and then of course there's very famous quotes by like C.S. Lewis, etc. I can't like say it specifically, but it's something along the lines of, like if this is to be true, then it is the most important thing ever, and if it's not, then it doesn't matter.
exactly.
So like that's kind of a like a I guess pragmatic argument, and that's also what's remind me of the Enlightenment's philosopher.
Pascal?
Yeah, Pascal's wager as well
Mm-hmm.
with that. But do you think that that's just fear of dogmatic, I guess, statements about the afterlife and like potential punishment for things that you can do Because I know that that's kind of a really big thing that drives fundamentalism is fear of the potential like punishments such as hell or whatnot. So are you distinguishing what you have to say about that from just like people in fear of punishment in the afterlife?
Um, well, if I'm understanding the question right, then I guess in that sense, what's driving me is very similar to what's driving the fundamentalists, which is maybe a fear of wasting the one life that we have, and then if there is an afterlife, then a fear of of wasting the afterlife by spending in infinite suffering or something like that.
Hmm.
So in that sense, I'm similar to religious fundamentalists. Does
With
that
your
answer the?
drive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Not really, because I'm having a hard time understanding the, I guess, amalgamation of like this life and the afterlife. Like, because I feel like systems of thought that dictate your lives today are almost very different from systems of thought that dictate your life now in relation to something after life, because um, you need to have firm belief in a dogmatic principle in order to conceptualize a life after your own life. Whereas I feel that if you're living for your foreseeable future on Earth, then you can be as skeptical as you want and still come out with very useful systems of thought. Say, like the modern atheists are proposing some kind of futures where we're all scientifically flourishing because of our rational societies that are progressing forward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do think there's a separation between claims about living for um, our lives on Earth and like more fundamental claims of living for life after death.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you find that distinction, or do you see it more like what is that distinction to you? How do you interpret that?
The distinction of living life with a view to how it should best be lived, uh, in the here and now versus in some hypothetical nebulous
Yes.
afterlife. Um, well, I have a constant struggle between whether I should about which way I should conceive of my life. I guess, in the sense that to bring up Pascal's wager again, right? If I don't believe and God doesn't exist, then that's good for me. I didn't waste a finite amount of time. But if I don't believe and God does exist, then that's possibly an infinite amount of time of infinite suffering. And so I think that if one is to consider the possibility that God is real, then well, I've lost my train of thought. But it is integral to think about how you would live this life with a view to ensuring the best possible afterlife,
Mm-hmm.
if that is a possibility at all, its existence.
So, however, what if, and I'm not making this claim about you because I know you're a very balanced person, but what if, say, you adhere to some kind of dogma that says that this must be spread worldwide, like, and no matter the cost, and if that meant, like, maybe mobilizing a force of, like, national interest in order to, like, all I'm trying to point out that these dogmas in this train of thought lead to some pretty less than optimal outcomes on Earth when people are too focused on what happens in the afterlife. And I know that you're a very individual person in your thinking, and that you are less inclined to adhere to something like a movement like this. But do you admit that when thinking about these dogmas, as they stem from fundamental inclinations, like your very rational ones, do you see the potential problems when it comes to, I guess, the standard texts that are the carriers of these fundamental systems of belief?
Could you repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah, so like, do you see the potential danger in adhering to a fundamental ideology, like in yourself at least?
Um, Yeah, I would say so.
Because once you put down something as a given and internally as a given, for whatever reason, whether that's fear of hell or because of a tradition that you've inherited or anything like that, it comes with all the baggage of that. And I'm saying that we shouldn't turn a blind eye to this baggage that comes with these fundamental ideologies.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I definitely think there's a big danger in that, and that might be part of what's kept me away from really becoming religious. This fear of one wasting my time with something that's irrelevant to actual existence if God doesn't exist, but then also this possibility of making the one life that we do have worse.
So is this a very personal relationship with these, like, just say, self perceived or self selected dogmas?
I'm not sure I understand.
So you're saying that in your grappling with faith and whatnot, it's a very, would you say it's more of an individual thing? Like you're not that too inclined to participate en masse in an ideological framework, or
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a more individual thing, and I think you brought up the earlier the idea of evangelism and how there's some religious sects which partake in forced
yeah.
conversions
No,
and
of course,
things
that's kind of what I was
to
talking
that
about, like the
extent.
Inquisition, and then of course like land issues,
Mm-hmm.
like the Inquisition forced evangelism, and then also like national interest that you see, like historically with like Muslim
Mm-hmm.
nations, and like just when it comes to fundamental texts, when it comes with all this cultural history and cultural baggage that is just not modernly accepted as like very productive and almost like objectively condemnable in many of these
Mm-hmm.
circumstances, it's kind of tricky to stick with any of these, let's say, sacred texts
Mm-hmm.
and the traditions that they come with. And I'm not saying that it's impossible, like, but yeah, that's kind of what I was kind of getting at when I was talking about the baggage that comes with these
Mm-hmm.
dogmas.
Well, as regards things like evangelization and forced conversions, I guess what I would say is my view, and this holds, I think, whether or not I have any religious belief. But my view is that it's my duty to spread the truth, but it's not my duty whatsoever to make other people follow the truth.
Sure, and that's, I guess, akin to like modern day evangelism in like liberal
Mm-hmm.
societies, just more of
Mm-hmm.
the, that's kind of the accepted thing, which is
Yeah,
pretty cool.
and I would say I can't speak for any other scriptures, but I would say that's certainly the view which is supported by the Quran, although certain militant groups would lead you to believe otherwise.
And I think that's highly debated as well. Not debated, but I think there are bad players who manipulate texts to, I guess, like justify um, radical action. Would you agree?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that goes on. Well, it goes on. That goes for the very radical side, but then it also goes for the very liberal side. I think that people on all sides tend to interpret scriptures often according to whatever preconceived notions they want to confirm.
Yeah.
When really, for a truly religious person, it should probably be other way around and see where the scripture takes you. Is what I would
Mm.
assume, anyways.
Yeah, I guess a very like self-auditing interpretation where one is constantly checking their own bias too.
Mm-hmm.
And is that kind, are you tipping towards any like systematic theology in any form lately, recently?
Mm-hmm. So my metaphysical beliefs change frequently, sometimes several times a day, depending on my mood. But I would say that well, generally I'm either an atheist or a Neoplatonist, I guess. And I guess I should probably explain what Neoplatonism is. I don't think I could do a very good job explaining it in detail, but the idea, if I'm remembering correctly, is that there's at the top of the hierarchy of things, I guess, would
Mm-hmm.
be the one, and so this would be God, I guess, but it would be an uncreated thing, which couldn't even exactly be called a thing. But from this
Sure.
one, everything else that exists is emanated, sort of. So, in a sense, that means that everything is separate from the one and yet also part of it. This is, I believe, called panentheism, if I'm remembering correctly.
Mm.
And so then the idea is that there's kind of a hierarchy, I guess, of creation in terms of things closeness to the one, and so then the one would be the most abstract, and then you would have things which become progressively less abstract and more physical, and then finally the physical world, which would be kind of a symbolic
Yeah.
manifestation of the immaterial archetypes of the higher
Yeah,
worlds.
and philosophy and psychoanalysis has been interpreting this, I guess, framework of interpreting reality for a long time. I can
Mm-hmm.
assume, like, from, I think it was Freud, if I'm right, talking about, what's it called? Do you have the words?
The collective unconscious or something else.
Yeah, the
That was
collective
more
unconscious,
young, I
and
believe.
then
Yeah.
yeah, okay, Jung, you're right, and then of course Plato, um, yeah, so like these abstract conceptions of things that exist within, like, almost in, um, yeah, and that exist in abstraction because of the collective experience of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Now, since we're on the topic of Jung, I guess I should bring up my probably primary disagreement with the psychoanalytical interpretation
sure.
of religion, which I used to adhere to, which is, I guess, the fact that these are ultimately naturalistic reinterpretations of religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're taking these doctrines which people have. I don't want to say people have interpreted them literally, because obviously people have understood metaphors for as long as language has existed. But people have seen as people have historically seen these claims made in religious scriptures or in philosophical treatises like the Enneads, which would be seen as the most important text for the Neoplatonic philosophy. People have seen these claims historically as being claims about the objective nature of the world around and outside of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so inevitably this pertains to the individual and what's inside of the individual, especially insofar as we would say that that according to these traditional philosophies, an individual might be said to be kind of a microcosm, which symbolizes the macrocosm of the outside world or reflects it in some way. But what the psychoanalysts are doing is they're taking it as a given. I would say that there's nothing beyond the material world, and that all of these claims are actually kind of metaphors for things that are only going on within our own mind, which is, of
Okay.
course, arguably not the claim that's made in religious scriptures. I guess there's more leeway in terms
Yeah.
of how we interpret religious scriptures, but then it's certainly not the claim that's being made in more philosophical texts like
So,
the Enneads, whose purpose is specifically to figure out what's going on with the world around us.
okay, so that's a lot to work with, but if I'm understanding this right, you reject material interpretations of this Neoplatonism because the only way to approximate actual knowledge of these metaphysical, let's say, truths for now is through faith and through, I guess, appeal to the metaphysical or the divine.
Um, I don't know if that's exactly what I was saying, but I would say that to a large extent I do agree with that.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. So, how do you make a. Okay, talk about how you make claim to metaphysical truth, even if it's personal truth or personal belief. How is it through this reading all this literature and figuring it all out? So, in a very as concisely as possible, because I think I kind of want to take what you've laid out right now and
Mm-hmm.
get an understanding of why do you believe that there's something outside of the material, and if it's too if it's very complex and hard to follow, like I think it kind of has been, that's okay as well. And I think that's okay to admit. But is there a standout reason why you appeal to the belief in the metaphysical?
Um, well, I hate to say it, but I think nothing has really changed since the time I was 7 years
Okay,
old, which is to
sure.
say that my beliefs change essentially based on intuition, and
Okay, so it's just feeling.
I could not particularly I couldn't have backed up my disbelief in God back then, and nor could I back up my shall we say 51% belief in God now.
So you're kind of just playing with a bunch of ideas because you don't want to just um fall back into the blanket of atheism. Not like it's a bad thing, but you're just this inquiry is fueled by some kind of curiosity for what something that's out there. And
Mm-hmm.
it kind of realizes itself in your appreciation of all these intellectuals and literature, and you're kind of searching your way through that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think that then you have a really interesting few years ahead of you if you keep plucking at these strings of the metaphysical, because I think there's a lot of, I guess, strings to pull at when it comes to these topics, right?
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you. That was a very interesting groundwork that you laid out for your own, and I hope that you continue to flesh out. But here's what we're gonna do now. I'm gonna throw some ideas at you,
Mm-hmm.
and we're gonna see your relationship with them in order to start pulling at these strings. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I look at your potential, um, I guess, framing of religious or metaphysical or divine knowledge is through appeals to dogmas, right? I would say that I'm a very spiritual person, um, but I think that it is not found at all in dogmas. I think it is found in rationality and skepticism.
Spirituality, that
Yes,
is?
and I also don't think that um, that this should be interpreted in frameworks of dogmatism, because I do think where there has been utility of dogmas in the past through scriptures like the Bible, like the Quran, for maintaining societies and whatnot, I don't think that you can appeal to them in a dogmatic way. And I want to be specific about this. I've been saying this word dogma a lot, but I realize that it's not very useful. But the way I look at it is that dogma claims that something is true um, throughout all of time and forever will be true, at least within our like temporal framework of humanity that we have created. Um, I, however, don't think that's true. I'm a very skeptical person, and I think that truth is very hard to come by, but I think that's a different philosophical endeavor. So, right now, I'm going to set out a framework of how I've kind of come to understand spirituality. So, um, I do think that the things like the Bible and the Quran have pointed at something. And I do think that people's relationship with the divine um, is very similar in their frameworks, but very different in their means of attaining it. So,
Sorry, which are?
so all religions they tap into the same idea of what like what is beyond sensation
Mm-hmm.
and like what is beyond um, material understanding, but they do it through different means. Like say one does it through belief in Jesus Christ and another in Allah.
Sure, different
Yeah.
paths up the same
Um,
mountain.
and so I think I take a very open stance on this, and I think this is where the religious types would disagree with me. Um, is that anything that is beyond perception is divine and unknowable. And that also comes with my critique of revelation. I don't think that you can claim that revelation exists because at the end of the day, there is going to be things that we cannot sense. We are limited by our frameworks of space and time in our perception, and also like our perception of like the colors that are available to us, the textures that are available for sensation, all of that. We're very limited beings, and I think there is something beyond that limit. Um, and I think it deserves to be worshipped. And I think that is a very personal thing because just because I worship that which is beyond myself doesn't mean that everybody else can come to that conclusion simply through logic or other means of attaining that. Um, yeah, so I'm a very skeptical person, But in that skepticism, I come to the realization that there are things that I cannot know, and I have found a useful relationship, which is, I guess, in one instance, worship or something approximating like an irrational thankfulness for that which is not understandable like through material means. So, I
Mm-hmm.
what is your relationship then to a skepticism towards knowledge of the divine? So, how how do you see the proper relationship with like faith? And do you think we should be skeptical or do you think that we should be yeah.
Well, this is something I think about like several times a day. The relationship between reason and faith, and to what extent we should be rational. And I guess I would say that I would encourage rationality wherever possible. Uh, and so, in that sense, really, I suppose that in the absence of any compelling evidence for or against the existence of God, really, one should have no opinion whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. I agree with
And
that. I
so,
think that we shouldn't have I think that our arguments for things like free will and stuff like that, where
mm,
it lies in the domain of like impossible understandings, like we can't actually make much more ground intellectually than we have. We should be focused on like pragmatic solutions. So that would be the rejection of all of this baggage that comes with dogma and the propagation of, or sorry, not propagation, but like this, um, the collective appreciation of the free will because it's useful, with an understanding that we might be wrong. Um,
mm.
yeah, I hope that makes sense. But yeah,
um,
continue.
well, if I'm understanding you right, I guess I would have to say that I don't think we should hold viewpoints simply because they're useful.
I do think we should, though.
I would even go so far as to say that we should hold the true, we should believe in the truth, even if it's actively unuseful and detrimental to us.
Well, I think I've gone down the skeptical rabbit hole where truth is very incredibly limited and it's limited only to perception and it is incredibly difficult to share. I mean at least in many of the domains, say in the humanities section of like the universities, say history, say literary interpretation, say whatnot, I think truth is an impossible task. So I do think that utility is the proper um, end instead of that. But yeah, that's where I stand.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that being said, how do you interpret truth then?
How do I interpret truth?
Is this like a very rigorous scientific mapping out of um like what we see around us? Like
Um, I'm not sure I understand the question.
so hmm. So when you say truth, what would that look like if we should not orient ourselves to what we deem as useful, but to what we deem as truthful? What do you mean by that?
Well,
Like, what does
for
that look like in the individual?
um, well, on a more abstract level, I guess if we think of 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, this is I mean, not a particularly useful or detrimental truth, right? It's just a simple truth with no bearing on. I mean, I guess we've used it in useful ways. This knowledge, but the knowledge itself is not. We don't believe in it because it's useful, right? We believe in it because we simply think that it's not
Yeah.
false.
But then I
Um,
would say that we understand 1 plus 1 is 2 because of um our our dispositions as human beings to map out things mathematically because it suits our interests.
hmm,
A giraffe doesn't know how to do geometry, or at least that we know of, because a giraffe doesn't need to do geometry. But as humans have developed more complex and more, let's say, difficult challenges to overcome, we have used our frameworks, our dispositions to see things mathematically in order to solve problems. And we can, that doesn't mean that it's only suited for utilitarian ends, but I think at the end of the day, it's not relevant that 1 plus 1 equals 2 unless it screws with our um, systems on which we have built useful things. And I do think
Mm-hmm.
that, like, I do think that we can have shared understanding, and I like saying that this table is here. I think we
Mm-hmm.
can ask anyone and they would agree that this table is here.
Right.
But I don't think that it is necessarily true just because I'm that skeptical, because we could all be in a simulation. Because with
Mm-hmm.
enough skepticism, one becomes solipsistic. Um, and that means that they don't think anything is true, except the fact that something inside of them is experiencing something, and they should manipulate everything else around them in order to make that experience as good as possible, no matter what, because they don't believe that other people um, exist really,
Right.
as except as a perception in their head.
Well, on that topic, I guess it is worth noting the fundamental importance of faith, right? Because if we think about
Exactly.
it, there's not really there's no way to justify the belief that logic is a useful system of understanding things without resorting to logic as a means of proving it, right?
Yeah.
So there's no non-circular argument for the trustworthiness of logic. And so in that sense, to even believe that there is such a thing as truth, let alone a possibility of us attaining truth, is indeed a proposition of faith, I guess, which is not really grounded in any rationality.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I do think that we have to you have to have some degree of faith to believe that the other 8 billion people around the world are actually there
Mm-hmm.
and actually can experience pain and whatnot. And that's what keeps you from solipsism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do think we need to reframework our understandings of everything as tools, like, and just means to ends. And I think the big philosophical question of our time is what should that end be?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I really do think that everything is a tool, but I do think that you can. That being said, you cannot survive without faith.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, I'm in agreement with you there.
yeah,
And so, would you say that knowledge should only be pursued if it's going to be useful in some way?
no, because I do
Okay.
think the pursuit of knowledge is an aesthetically meaningful thing, and
Mm-hmm.
I do think that is fundamental in our ends as a species is to pursue aesthetic greatness. And if you can make a career out of that, that is you're one lucky person.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the I guess math PhDs out there, you should be eternally grateful that our society allows you to maintain your position,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So I'm sure that's a very much food for thought for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly.
And I do think we started at very different dispositions intellectually at the beginning of this conversation. Hence why
Mm-hmm.
it's been very hard to communicate on some of these topics and whatnot. But I think that's okay. And I think that the what we should um take away from this conversation is that we should do it again, and two, um have empathy for the other's disposition,
Mm-hmm.
and then try to figure out what's going on, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we touched on things that people have been talking about for hundreds of years, but it's like this conversation is just a moment in time at which we have different relationships to the intellectual conversations that have already happened
Mm-hmm.
in the past 300, 400 years, right?
Yeah.
Because me personally, I think that all of the novel ideas that people ever have in like fundamental aspects like philosophy have already been claimed, or at least like for the most part we're like our collective philosophy is like 98% fulfilled and
So you
manifested.
think philosophy is almost done as an area of study, an
I
area of knowledge?
no, I think it's done, but I still think the conversations need to keep happening to determine um like what's useful. Like say um if we just take the COVID situation, and there's a bunch of policy being made around like personal freedoms, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I think the philosopher should ask, okay, what does it mean to be free, and how does that manifest in the lives of people?
Mm-hmm.
Are they giving themselves the illusions of happiness as a result of these freedoms? There's lots of meaningful questions to ask,
Mm-hmm.
and I do think that philosophical research isn't that. It is often very useless, but I don't think it has to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that it's still relevant as a field, and I think it will always be relevant. But I do think that on fundamental things like the idea of the being and the soul and whatnot, we've kind of exhausted our potential analysis, etc.
Mm.
And I don't think our connections are complete either. I think connections between different literary works within the domain of philosophy, etc., haven't been fulfilled either. Um, and like, of course, what's it the spread of ideas and information on these topics is not obviously not circulated globally or even in cities or communities or even in universities themselves, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's just like you yourself as an individual have a relationship to all of the conversations that have been happening for the past like 400 years,
Mm-hmm.
and it's your job to navigate them and figure out what is your relationship with them, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's almost very similar to like your relationship with your faith. Like, what do you choose or to put your faith in, because it changes how you live in the now. And if you choose to believe that after death you're gonna go to hell, I think that that could screw you over for the next 30 years of your life. And I think
Mm-hmm.
there could be freedoms that you could experience, and a mitigation of fear and whatnot that could be useful. So I do think the proper answer is skepticism, at least for people with, say, who want it, because I'm not blaming any like decent citizen who's a Christian to denounce his faith and find some rational solution to live their life. I'm not saying it's for everyone. I'm saying I do think there is a lot of utility in religious systems. I think there's a lot of community surrounding it and whatnot. But I do think that just in general, in the next 300 years, if um, 300, 400 years, I think the proper means to figure out proper ways of living and the most meaningful ways of living is through skepticism rather than dogmas. Because I just do think that in 2023, the baggage that comes with dogmas have started to overshadow its actual place in culture.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and then also just different cultural reasons have rendered it um, unable to fulfill the role it once had. So yeah, that's kind
Mm-hmm.
of my closing, not closing, but my summary of our conversation right now. And I know I've been like going on for a little bit, so I was just wondering if that strikes the relevant chord with you.
Yeah, I think so. But if I may add
Yeah, go
one
for it.
thing, I would, although we're in agreement that skepticism is the correct default position, at the same time, I think at some point a decision just needs to be made, and you just need to believe something. So
Oh, totally.
there's a story called Candide by the Enlightenment philosopher
Mm-hmm.
Voltaire, and I won't go into the details of that story, but at the end of the story, the characters are all tilling a garden. And one of the characters breaks into abstract metaphysical discourse,
Mm-hmm.
and stops tilling the garden,
Yeah.
and then one other character, I think it's Martin or some character, says that's all well and good, but at the end of the day, we have a garden to till, and
Yeah.
I think
I
that
totally agree.
says something about how although it's good to to be skeptical and to wonder things, at some point you also just have to accept
Yeah,
things as they
totally.
are.
And I mean, to an extent, like, I'm not in a place where I'm, like, having an existential crisis over these things. Like, I've come to peace with how I'm living my life. Um, totally. And, like, at this point, it's just a hobby. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just reading literature on this stuff. But, um, yeah, so I'm not worried about that. But, and I do realize that, like, there is a big tension out there right now with like loss of faith, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to um, make known that you can have a meaningful and useful life. You can bring yourself meaning and happiness, and bring meaning and happiness to the people around you through a variety of ways. But I think it is on you as an individual to cultivate the proper relationship with your faith and the proper relationship with your intellectual framework
Mm-hmm.
to become a good, like, let's just say, quote in quote, good person. So yeah, that's me in relationship to all this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything that you'd like to close with?
Um, well, hopefully we'll be able to do this again sometime in the next
Yes,
few months, and
totally.
who knows, maybe I'll be an atheist again by that point, or maybe I'll not be, but who can say?
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for joining me, Marek.
My pleasure.